I call upon you, O God, for you will answer. Show us your marvelous loving kindness. When I was a kid, Jacob was one of my favorite Bible characters. We had a lot in common, as I saw it. We were both second-born kids whose relationships with our elder sibling was strained, in part because we were sly, and, at least in my case, charming enough to get out of trouble more often than not. We were both smart, crafty, and willing to bend a few rules in order to get our way. We set goals for ourselves and tenaciously pursued them. If Jacob were sorted into a Hogwarts house, he would totally be a Slytherin. And while many biblical narratives featured characters who walked steadfastly along God's path, or sought God's heart, or demonstrated extraordinary faith, Jacob's story suggested to me that there is room in God's love for a trickster who is willing sometimes to wrestle with God rather than meekly submit in order to obtain God's blessing. Jacob's story reassured me that God isn't just willing to put up with difficult people. God rewards and loves them. As a difficult and prickly kid, and now as the parent of a difficult and prickly kid, I've always needed and appreciated that reassurance that God loves me in all of the rich, messy glory of the challenges I represent, not in spite of them. Jacob shows us that God doesn't need things to be easy in order to share abundant, transformative love with us. When I look at all of our readings today, I'm inclined to wonder whether God just wants us to show up, to be persistent, to wrestle with our difficult faith, and in that struggle, in that striving, allow God to transform our lives and our hearts. Our gospel passage this morning picks up right as Jesus learned of the death of his cousin, John. In grief, perhaps, Jesus withdrew from his disciples and went to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds of people heard that Jesus was near, and perhaps they also had some kind of feelings about John's death, they sought Jesus out in the deserted place, and Jesus, seeing them, was moved by compassion to heal their sicknesses. Grief is a funny thing, different for each of us. Sometimes I think that there's no feeling more human, but then sometimes maybe I think I've got it wrong, and the grief that we feel in our hearts is a reflection of God crying out. I don't know. So I love this passage from Matthew for giving us a glimpse of Jesus in all his messy humanity, withdrawing from his disciples, going full introvert by taking a boat to get some physical distance from everyone. We don't really know how long he stayed there, alone. We don't know how he felt about the crowds intruding on his solitary grief. Was he angry? Exasperated? So tired? Maybe. But the crowd's persistence in striving towards him, maybe to support him in his grief, maybe to find relief for their own, caused a transformation within Jesus. He was moved to compassion and moved to act out of that compassion, to care for the people who were so tenacious in following him. Evening fell, and the disciples were clearly ready to be done with the hassle of all those people, and suggested that Jesus send the people away so that they could go find dinner somewhere. Jesus, by that point fully grounded in his compassion for the people, instead challenged his disciples to move towards compassion themselves and actively care for the people. You give them something to eat. I think it's significant that Jesus invites his disciples to see the people as more than a nuisance and empowers them to carry a miraculous and abundant feast out into the crowd, nourishing and caring for them for no reason other than that they showed up. The crowd of people may not have wrestled with God, but they did strive after Jesus' presence, and he blessed them. In the feeding of the 5,000, plus, all the women and children they didn't bother to count, we can see a glimpse of God's economy, abundant, generous, always enough for anyone who needs it, and available to all who strive for it. And we can find for ourselves a call to carry active compassion out into the world, to look beyond our own griefs and see in each other the hunger that can be satisfied and the thirst that can be quenched. It is not enough to wrestle and strive towards a relationship with God. We must let that relationship transform our hearts and our minds so that we can be Christ's hands and feet in the world, tenaciously rooting ourselves in compassion, sharing God's abundant, active love. In his posthumous letter to the nation published this week, John Lewis wrote, "I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people, motivated simply by human compassion, laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate the way of peace. The way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring." The world is full of hungry people, those whose bellies cry out for sustenance, and those who yearn for justice. Whether we are like Jesus, feeling that compassion right away, or like the disciples, needing an extra poke or two to get into the right spirit, it is ultimately on us to act, to bring God's healing and sustaining love to all who need it. When we do that, we will see God's face, and we will be transformed. Jacob might have started out a cunning trickster who fought with God for a blessing, but he became the father of a nation through which God revealed God's truth and love. There's no telling all the ways that God can transform our lives, revealing through them, through us, the compassionate, loving, healing heart of Jesus, using us to nourish and strengthen God's children, to fight for justice, to stand up for human dignity. Let us go forth and let freedom ring. Thanks be to God.